Hey everybody, welcome to Tech vs. Psych, where we combine the latest in neurotechnology with ancient wisdom, supercharge your brain. I'm Dr. Cody Rawl, your medical doctor confidant. I've got the perfect episode for you guys today. I sat down with Marty Wuttke, the founder of the Wuttke Institute. Marty has over 30 years of neurofeedback experience, and it was so interesting in sitting down with him and talking about the progression of neurofeedback culture and technology over the course of his career, and the explosion of interest in the last couple of years, especially with the introduction of neurofeedback wearables. So we talked about brainwaves, his philosophy of using neurofeedback meditation, different protocols that he might use, as well as the interaction between meditation and neurofeedback in a person's self-development to really get them to new heights. We also talked about the place of neurofeedback wearables in this niche and the ideas of technological progression and what might be on the horizon for neurofeedback in the near future.
So hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. I'm here with Marty Wuttke, CEO and founder of the Wuttke Institute. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Cody. Great to be here.
And I actually heard about you through one of my prior clients that had gone to your, I think it was your 2-week intensive course, and was just raving about it and said, you have to talk to this guy. He's been in the biofeedback and neurofeedback field for decades and is doing really great work out there. So it's really nice to talk to you. And I've heard a lot of some of your podcasts as well as your videos, and what struck me most is that I think a lot of people are getting into neurofeedback now because of increased accessibility, but there's a lot of wisdom that needs to be talked about from all your work. So I'd appreciate it if you could just tell us, you know, your background and how you originally got into bio and neurofeedback.
Okay, great. Well, it's a long story, so I'll try to shorten it as best I can. I originally started out to be a chiropractor. That's how I ended up in Georgia, where I started my practice. But I went to chiropractic school, and part of the way through there, I got on a very strong spiritual search. I was into this sort of philosophical, you know, I want to find the truth, and you know, started meditating and looking at various Eastern traditions and so on. And what happened was I left chiropractic school and moved up to North Georgia to live at a meditation retreat center, way up in the mountains of North Georgia. So it was a very powerful experience, you know, really sort of semi-monastic, being able to meditate 6, 7, sometimes 8 hours a day in this reclusive environment. And I had a very well-known meditation teacher who was one of the last living disciples of Paramahansa Yogananda, the author of Autobiography of a Yogi, sort of a classic book. So I was there, living there, working there, meditating there, doing my spiritual practices. And I had gone through a period in my adolescence before that of rather significant challenges with drugs and so on. So, and meditation happened to be what pulled me out, and hence the, you know, sort of devoting my life to that. So one day, while I was living there at the meditation retreat center, I happened to find out there was a psychiatric hospital 7 miles away that specialized in drug and alcohol treatment, and I decided to go for a tour there, and I met the director of the hospital. And he asked me who I was, and I told him a little bit, and he said, well, would you like to do something for us? And I said, could I come in and teach meditation to, you know, a group of your patients? He said, absolutely. And they gave me a group of rather severe chemical dependent people to work with. And what happened was, after about 2 weeks of teaching them very basic meditation, I wasn't doing anything strange. And you have to remember, this is in the early 1980s. In the middle of Northeast Georgia, where meditation was pretty much unknown. So the people who were attending the meditations, I think I did them 3 days a week, started having rather strong experiences with pain control, with sleeping, again, with cravings for drugs and alcohol, depression, anxiety. And the medical director said, hey, I don't know what you're doing, but this is really helping. So, you know, would you consider something? And I had training in biofeedback prior to that. So I decided that I would, I would say, okay, well, I'll come in there and teach meditation, but I think we need to formalize it and bring the meditation model into a more, a recognizable scientific format. And back in the early 80s, there was some research on meditation. The transcendental meditation people had done some fairly good research. So I realized that the brain was the key to meditation. If you wanted to look for what meditation did to the mind and body, the place to look was the brain. There was changes that occurred in the EEG. And then one thing led to another. And what the hospital administrator said was, well, why don't you look at, how we can really formalize the meditation process with something like biofeedback? So I did. And that I got into EEG, started studying EEG, found some really good equipment, even back in the early 80s, that did 4 channels of EEG feedback. And we started using it there at the hospital, and immediately, it wasn't a big hospital, 35 beds, but immediately the results started to come through with the patients. And I'd see them twice a day for their 30-day stay. So we had our own building on the hospital campus, and we would run all of the patients through there twice a day. We did that for 12 years, so thousands and thousands of people. But this was, as you may know, the insurance industry started to give a lot of pushback to these types of treatment centers, even though we were JCAH approved and all that stuff. But the insurance companies started to say, hey, we would rather you put these people on medication and get them back out on the street. So the hospital finally closed, I believe it was 1997. And I had a considerable amount of experience at that point, had been published in a lot of the biofeedback magazines, as well as started to do work in Europe. And my name was well known. I was training people by that point. So it was no problem for me when the hospital closed. I opened up clinics in Atlanta, Georgia, and then North Georgia, and then clinics in Europe, Holland specifically. So that, and the work expanded at that point as well. We started to do a lot more work with kids, and a lot of that was the result of my son being injured at birth. So we started to develop treatment protocols for children who had either autism or damage at birth. And that led to the creation of Jacob's Ladder, which is quite a center, named after my son Jacob, which is quite a center in Roswell, Georgia. If your listeners know anybody whose child is challenged, Jacob's Ladder is the place to send them. Remarkable place, brainwave biofeedback, and a whole neurodevelopmental approach for kids with various challenges, even very severe kids. So I ended up here in California after having my clinic there in Georgia, moved out here, I think it was around 2014, so not too long ago. And California really embraces this type of therapy, particularly where I am in Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara is very progressive, and the opportunities here to sort of spread neurofeedback out have been many. I've got just finished I didn't finish the project, but I'm just supervising it now. We're doing 360 parolees through the state. So the California Department of Rehabilitation okayed the study, and we have a control group. So we're training these fellows in with neurofeedback to see if we improve their brains. Can we reduce the recidivism rate? Because the recidivism rate among parolees is pretty high, anywhere from 65 to 90%. Nobody's really quite sure. So that study's underway. It'll be done in about 2 years. The openings that have occurred here for this type of therapy, in conjunction with other therapies, is quite profound. So we're doing a lot of work here, and I treat a lot of very severe clinical disorders. But as you mentioned earlier, I also do these 2-week intensives for just, people who just want to improve their brain, improve their performance, sharpen things up. It's the peak performance model. And that's that's taking off quite a bit. We stay pretty full with people who want that model. We're probably going to reopen our office in North Georgia as well, because some people are on the East Coast, some people are here on the West Coast, and we found that us going back and forth helps some people logistically anyway. So we haven't done that yet, but that may happen next year.
Are you finding any difference in awareness of what neurofeedback and biofeedback are in the years that you've practiced in the general population, or people that you've come into contact with? Is there more awareness of what these practices are? Have you found
that has been very recent? I mean, honestly, Cody, I felt like I was pushing a rock up a hill for many years, and just the past year or two, I think I'm even being conservative. It has gone exponential. The numbers of practitioners out there has it's just in certain cities where a few years ago I would say, somebody would ask me for a referral, and I'd say, well, I don't know anybody in your area, and then I go on Google and there's 10 practitioners there now. So it has really exploded. And when I do lectures and presentations, which I do quite often, there's a dozen people in the audience. Oh yes, I've done neurofeedback. It's awesome. And my biggest reservation was that not enough physicians were getting educated about neurofeedback. And I think that's the population that's lagging the most. I've seen that very slow, slow to learn about it, slow to accept it. But here in Santa Barbara, it's really quite accepted now. So,
yeah, I'd have to say, whenever I talk about neurofeedback in front of a crowd of physicians, there's usually a hand or two that go up and ask, "Is this FDA approved?" And it's almost asking as if meditation is FDA approved, in my opinion. So yeah, I've had the similar experience. The medical model is so entrenched in this idea that you have to use these medications to instantly fix the problem, rather than do the deep work that you talk so much about in your talks. And to parlay into that, how many of these neurofeedback traditioners do you think these days have a strong meditation background, or from what you've seen in the past? Because it sounds like that's something that you stress as well. Is it's this overall picture of having a strong meditation experience to be able to understand how to apply the neurofeedback and how to use it.
Yeah, not many, and that's unfortunate, because some of the godfathers in the field are Elmer Green and his late wife Elise. He might have even passed away, but he wrote Beyond Biofeedback many years ago, and he was really pointing to this model that neurofeedback, yes, it's extremely helpful and effective for clinical disorders, but beyond biofeedback, there's this other model of spiritual growth, spiritual development, meditation. And unfortunately, that book got sort of put on the side for many clinicians, because they were more interested in this medical model. So there's a few out there. Every once in a while I'll do a search and I'll see, oh yeah, this particular teaching or group is interested in the meditation model, or this one or this one. I'm in the process with my wife right now of writing a book called The Way of Neurofeedback, just like the way of this or the way of that. Neurofeedback is a discipline that will lead to a greater clarity of awareness, and greater clarity of awareness naturally leads to a life that is much more productive and starts to manifest some of the spiritual qualities that a person whose life really starts to unfold will manifest. So we're working on that, but I would say there's probably 2 or 3 other schools of thought out there that are looking at this meditation model.
Mm-hmm. And what I was going to ask is, in your mind, how does neurofeedback inform meditation, and how does meditation inform neurofeedback? How are those two disciplines influenced by each other?
Well, first of all, you have to understand meditation and the many, many dynamic changes that occur in the meditator's nervous system. From the beginning, when we start to meditate, we're essentially engaging in a process of self-directed neuroplasticity. And depending on the type of meditation that we learn, we are going through really a neurological process of change as we start with the basic breath awareness meditations or relaxation awareness, just learning how to quiet the autonomic nervous system, get the sympathetic and parasympathetic balanced, and then gradually moving on to different stages of meditation. And all of those stages correlate with rather profound psychophysiologic changes. And yes, they correlate with changes in the EEG and the brainwaves too. So, the teachers of meditation have been around thousands of years and have, one of the ones that I've followed the most is Patanjali, who developed the 8 limbs of yoga. So Patanjali said, in order to meditate, you had to first, and it wasn't necessarily a hierarchy, but certainly these things were part of the meditation process. So first was to get your body to relax by practicing the postures, the asanas. The second was to practice certain moral and physical principles called the yamas and niyamas. So observances, cleanliness, harmlessness, and we've all kind of like the 10 commandments of yoga. And then he said, then once you've been through those processes, then you start to practice pranayama or breathing exercises. Then you start to practice concentration. See, most people start with concentration. They don't realize all this other stuff actually was taught before that. And then the concentration moves on to sensory withdrawal, to going within. Mm-hmm. That moves on to contemplation, where you really learn how to keep your mind focused on one contemplative thought. And then finally, meditation. But look at all the steps that went before that. So in this day and age, we have a technology that can help us with all of those steps. Rather than sit there and say, okay, I got a mantra, I'm going to practice this breath awareness, and I'm going to make myself meditate. So rather than have to jump into that, we have a technology that can, what you said, can inform us when we're actually going to that door that indicates we're concentrating, that brainwave activity, or to that brainwave activity that indicates that we are in the state of sensory withdrawal, where we're going within. Or we can go even further back in the hierarchy to the brainwave patterns or the brainwave feedback that has to do with balancing the autonomic nervous system. So that's why we're calling this book The Way of Neurofeedback. When you understand this hierarchy of changes the nervous system has to go through in order for one to really experience the deeper states of meditation, you realize that neurofeedback is this incredible tool that we have that isn't magic. It doesn't do anything to you. It just informs the meditation process of what stage you're at and where you can go. At the same time, though, you ask the inverse of that. How does meditation inform biofeedback? Well, I just saw an example of this today. I had a client who is here for some other reasons, but she was a transcendental meditation teacher 25 years ago. She got it the first session. It was remarkable. I said, see, all that training you've had, it enabled you to recognize what this computer program is asking your brain to do. And the results of the session were linear. It wasn't like up and all over the place. It was just straight. Her brain, it was a learning curve that was absolutely perfect. So that because I've seen it before, that is a result of her meditation. So there's a real complementary thing happening here that I think we can take advantage of as long as we understand the process and know how to guide somebody.
And what you just described there sound like operant conditioning, correct? Where she's picking up that feedback signal. And you said she got it instantly. Can you explain a little bit more about that? You had set certain parameters for her.
Yeah.
So what does it look like when someone gets it?
Okay. So I use in my clinic a very sophisticated neurofeedback. I use Loretta, and Loretta stands for low resolution electromagnetic tomography. But Loretta is the closest thing to a three-dimensional neurofeedback that we have, where we can peek down into Brodmann areas. It also is based on Z-scores, so that we're not arbitrarily picking brainwaves like we used to do, and it worked. I'm not saying this didn't work, but in the past, would say, oh, you need more alpha, or you have too much high beta, or you have too much theta. And then we pick a threshold and say, okay, we'll train this. And it worked. But this Loretta training with Z-scores is quite different. So it uses the 19, I got a cap right here, the 19 channel cap. And all of these electrodes are active and using a three-dimensional algorithm to pinpoint certain areas of the brain. And so with this lady, she had a particular problem that we identified Z-scores that were outliers in areas of her brain that correlated with some of the problems and complaints she had. And it ended up being, I think, about 90 metrics. So everything from delta up to alpha 1, alpha 2, up to beta 1, 2, and 3, and primarily in coherence issues. So we were training 90 different things, and I was giving her audio feedback, so just a tone. I didn't want her eyes open, so eyes closed. And so the computer would give her a tone every time that those 90 metrics were moving towards the mean. In other words, those outliers were moving towards the center, slowly dropping those Z-scores. So little by little, you could see she was orienting to the signal, and therefore her brain was orienting to what we were asking it to do. And as I watched over the session, I just left the threshold alone, and you could see her scores just going up and up and up and up. So her brain was grasping. She didn't know what she was doing. She just knew that my instruction was, okay, you hear that sound, I want you to not make the sound consistent. You won't be able to, but that sound is a good thing. And, and that's the thing about operant conditioning. You don't have to understand all these, technical aspects of it. They just have to sit there and orient themselves to the signal. And she got it. So,
now, do you know, are the Z-scores based off of population means?
Yeah, data. Yeah, this is Dr. Robert Thatcher, who was with the NIH and University of Maryland. And it's a big database. It's, I think it's from 6 months to 90 years old or something. And it's, of course, divided into age ranges because of the huge changes that occur in the EEG at various ages. So it's a, and the database is weeded out pretty well, no head injury and that sort of thing. And I still use straight amplitude training. I use the Muse and MindLift and so on. I have my own equipment that I had manufactured in Europe for alpha theta training, for instance. But Z-score training can be very effective when you combine them with other types of training. So I think it's a sort of a breakthrough in the field.
And that's so interesting to hear you talk about that. And do you have, I know in listening to you before, it's a very individualized approach, but is there a bit of a system there when you actually use the Z-score training versus amplitude training versus alpha theta training?
Yes, for sure. Again, back to this meditation model, we want to make sure the autonomic nervous system is stable before we move to deeper training or even focused in peak performance training. You can set the sympathetic nervous system off and get in a lot of trouble if you don't know what you're doing. Or you can set the parasympathetic off and trigger autoimmune issues. So you have to make sure things are stable first. And usually that's the Z-score training. It's very good at stabilizing the autonomics and just getting everything, all the electrical activity more efficient, so that then when things are more efficient, you can start to move to the alpha theta, to more deeper meditative states and so on. And that's the general rule. There's going to be exceptions and so on. It is highly individualized, but for the most part, that's the track that we take. First, get the foundation stable, which is the autonomic nervous system. Like, in other words, don't try to build the house from the roof down. focus on the foundation, and then build from there up.
And you mentioned some of the mobile technology that's coming out now, like Muse and MindLift. What's your view on the role of these devices coming into a solid neurofeedback practice?
I think they're an excellent adjunct. They're not a replacement, but they're an excellent adjunct. They fit well in, you know, if I get a client, you know, I'm here in Santa Barbara and I get clients from New Hampshire or Florida or Texas, and, you know, they leave and I'm like, okay, bye. It's like, it feels terrible, you know, and I don't always have somebody to refer them to. So having these mobile devices that we can monitor and watch over time is really awesome. And, you know, I think that the technology is still being improved. There's, I don't know how many devices out there, how many mobile devices. There's quite a few now. But I think the Muse is one of the better ones right now, with MindLift. So I think it's an excellent tool, as long as they're monitored properly. I do have to stress that. You have to know what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, and it sounded like you're working on your own band, the Focus Band from Australia. Would you mind telling us about that?
Well, frankly, I decided to drop that. I wasn't thrilled with some of the, I mean, I can't say anything good or bad about it, but I felt like the Muse may be the better iteration of this technology right now.
And do you feel like that's any particular thing, or a combination of the material science, the software? What impressed you about why that works, and what lessons can we learn from that device for further product development to further the field? What's your opinion on that?
Well, the one thing that has to happen is we have to be able to measure more areas of the brain for really good feedback to occur. You know, the Muse right now is just this frontal, but they've partnered with MindLift, the company out of Tel Aviv, software company, and now you can put an electrode and move that around. That is a huge improvement right there. But there are other devices out there that are trying to use 6 channels. I think there's NeuroSky is one of them. There's several other, I can't remember all the names, but they're trying to use more channels. And frankly, the more channels we get to, the more we'll be able to do, because this part of your brain, the occipital lobes, does something way different than the prefrontal lobes. And you know, there's vicarious connections all around, and there's neurofeedback practitioners who swear you only have to train CZ with sensory motor rhythm. But my experience is the more areas that we can access and target for specific reasons, the better the results, the more robust the results are over time.
And I'd love to get your explanation of your conceptual understanding of what's going on with these different brainwave frequencies in different areas of the brain, and how that relates to, you know, first getting the stabilization, but then also you talked about building a house on a solid foundation. So, you know, I think there's been a lot of research out there and a lot of little tidbits of data, so it's sometimes hard to coalesce, but if you could talk about that, I'd really appreciate that, because it's really nice to hear from someone that's been in the field for some time and have looked at it for some time, your conceptual understanding of what these brainwave frequencies are and how they are biomarkers for what people are experiencing.
That's pretty complicated.
Yeah.
Because you can say something about the brainwaves themselves, you know, the different frequencies, but that by itself is only half of the picture. You have to have the person in front of you, their symptoms, their history, and their genetics all play a role, and will either be influential as far as those frequencies go, or those frequencies influence all of the above. But, you know, in general, the slower frequencies are indicative sort of the rhythm section of the orchestra. They help this, you know, massive rhythm that the body has to keep, you know, circadian rhythm, and then everything else that's based on that. So delta is very much an indicator of that. We know as clinicians, if delta is not right, there's going to be a lot of problems. It can also be indicative of very severe disorders, you know, hepatic failure, among other things, you'll see excessive delta rhythm, and delta can be a pathological indicator. But from a basic standpoint, it is the timer, the timing switch for the rest of the brain, and it is probably driven from deeper areas of the brain. It's going to correlate with brainstem, and there's some speculation in the more esoteric understanding that delta is sort of you have to, well, obviously, then this is not so esoteric, you've got to hit delta sleep at night. If you don't, your body's not going to repair. Growth hormone gets squirted out when you hit that stage 4 sleep. And if you drink alcohol or too much caffeine or even certain sleeping pills that block delta sleep, it is absolutely essential. It's the healing, it's the place where the brain can heal. So in that sense, and by training delta awake with eyes open or eyes closed, you can normalize that delta rhythm, which is a remarkable thing. So delta is a very strong indicator, and is probably one of the most foundational in terms of the analogy I use. Then theta rhythm, theta is another one that has lots of good parts and lots of bad parts. So theta, in the negative sense, can be a brain that's very either dissociative or kind of offline. I'm not a big believer in labels, but if I was to say the majority of attention deficit disorder people with that label tend to have a good bit of theta. People who suffer with depression and, as I mentioned, dissociative disorders and such often have a lot of theta. It can also, though, be indicative of a very deep meditative state. There's literature that shows that as the meditator advances, their alpha dominant rhythm frequency, which is usually around 10 hertz, actually can start to drop and get down there around 7 hertz, which is theta, and that can be the predominant rhythm. But that's in an advanced meditator. That's not in somebody who just walks in off the street. If you see that, that could be a problem. Theta is also, and Elmer Green talked a lot about this in Beyond Biofeedback, and Swami Rama, who they did a lot of research on in the Menninger Institute. He used to call theta the doorway to the infinite library within. So theta is, sort of a way to, number one, access your own personal unconscious and lots of information that's in there, and perhaps the collective unconscious. And many of the discoveries and revelations and things that have occurred to various inventors and scientists and so on have occurred during reverie states, which are essentially theta states. Very powerful for visualization. If you can learn to harness theta, it is one of the most powerful states for healing, processing, and integrating trauma, as in post-traumatic stress disorder. But it needs a clinician to run the show. You just can't hook yourself up and say, okay, I'm going to make theta now. Boom. That's a little dangerous. But it is one of the most profoundly healing states there are, as far as all of the brainwave patterns, and it's psychodynamic. So it's less of a repair frequency and more of a psychodynamic. Then is alpha, and alpha is sort of the brain going into a neutral state, different mechanisms in the reticular activating system and the pacemaker systems. They're really what are driving alpha rhythm. Turn this part of the brain on, turn this part of the brain off. This part of the brain just needs to be quiet. And that's when you see these bursts of alpha rhythm occur. So alpha is a very important rhythm, primarily because most people don't have it. I mean, they may close their eyes and have a burst of alpha rhythm, but it is something that at the beginning of stages of meditation really needs to be cultivated, because alpha means the mind is starting to finally quiet down. Now, alpha is very interesting. Barbara Brown, I believe, she wrote a book on biofeedback. She said, as soon as you close your eyes and roll your eyes up, that triggers a big burst of alpha in the occipital lobes, which is quite interesting. But as you know, we will use alpha rhythm feedback and theta rhythm feedback for a lot of the training, because alpha is kind of at the surface of the water, and then theta is below the water. And so we want people to learn how to be comfortable up here at the surface and just hang out. But then we want to teach them how to go down deep and access those deeper levels. So alpha and alpha theta training can be very powerful. Again, another psychodynamic model, less of a brain repair model. So we have, I should have said that too, we have a psychodynamic approach and we have this sort of brain repair restoration approach too. So, in going back to what I said earlier, we want to repair and restore first, then we can go to the psychodynamic model. Okay. So above alpha is beta 1, called sensory motor rhythm, 12 to 15 hertz. And this was quite a discovery by Dr. Barry Sturman when he saw this in cats in that funny research accident, by the way. And sensory motor rhythm, has this incredible inhibitory effect on all kinds of paroxysmal activity in the brain. And, paroxysmal activity is not just seizure activity. Many of us have subclinical kindling, and that's behind, or some research has shown, is behind bipolar, dissociative disorders. Many disorders have some kindling going on. And it's just this electrical instability, these discharges. Well, if you train sensory motor rhythm with these people on the sensory motor strips and the supplementary motor area, it begins to quiet all that down and calm that. That's why it's so effective. Sensory motor rhythm is one of the most effective trainings for seizure disorders. But guess what? Guess what else produces a lot of sensory motor rhythm? Hatha yoga, the postures, Tai Chi, Qigong. These, like I said, these meditative tools actually change things in the brain that are extremely therapeutic. So I thought that was quite interesting when I found that study. So that's a very important rhythm for the brain, and it is another rhythm that is very foundational based. In other words, it can correct a lot of things that are happening in the brain just by training that rhythm. Then we get into the zone of betas, beta 2, 15 to 22 hertz roughly. And that's more focused attention, that's more cortical. It's cortical activation. And at the lower frequencies seem to be very important for concentration, focus, attention, and so on. And for meditation, you've got to be able to hold a focal point. Otherwise, according to some studies, our attention span is about 3 seconds. You can focus on one breath, but then you're gone. So training attention is important, and that's what the beta rhythm is very good for. Then as we go higher, up to 32, 38 hertz, those frequencies tend to be associated with activation and overactivation. It can be associated with cortical hyperexcitability. Oddly enough, it can be associated with leaky gut syndrome, because if you have a leaky gut barrier, you have a leaky brain barrier. And oftentimes, I'll see a QEEG where the head is bright red in the beta zones, the whole head. And I'll say, okay, we have to do a little gut analysis. And they're like, gut analysis? What about a brain analysis? No, gut analysis. And sure enough, there'll be leaky gut. And then inflammation markers. So we know that instead of focusing on this beta, what we have to actually focus on is this person's gut and their diet, and trying to heal up whatever is causing or creating the leaky gut syndrome. It's the only way to get at that inflammation that shows up as high beta. Then things get interesting, though, when you get above high beta. Then you get into gamma. And gamma is an interesting frequency because although there's negatives to gamma, again, it depends on the person, there are some profound, significant implications of gamma. And that goes back to research done by Richard Davidson, Dalai Lama's fellow, plus research that goes back to the 1950s in France with Daus, a fellow named Daus, D-A-U-S, and Gestalt. And they found these gamma waves in advanced meditators. And Richie Davidson found them in advanced Tibetan meditators. So it was actually Kriya meditators in France, Tibetan meditators here with Richie Davidson. And what that showed was there was gamma well above the norm in these advanced meditators that had it all the time. So you have to look at what gamma is an indication of. Gamma is a binding frequency. And when you have an aha, when you recognize somebody, when you learn something, you have a burst of gamma because it's pulling the brain together, pulling networks together. So things are electrochemically imprinted. But when you see it in advanced meditators, you're seeing this very heightened activity in the brain. And you're also seeing a person who has trained themselves to be very present time. And to, the Buddhists call it being very mindful. So rather than depending on the default mode network in the brain, which is all the past memory, it says, I don't like broccoli, I don't like that color person, I don't like that kind of car, I don't like default mode. But the gamma says, no, just be present, no judgment. Just be present. Don't use the past. Just be present. So it's a very powerful state to be in. And you, in order to reach that, though, like gamma, you can think about it this way. It's like sunshine, very bright. It really illuminates everything. And guess what? It doesn't care if it's illuminating flowers or weeds. And if you haven't taken care of the weeds by practicing, various tools to quiet the autonomic nervous system down and deal with some of the traumas, you haven't quieted them down and you start hitting gamma, it can stir things up quite a bit. So that's why we say before we train people to really get into higher states of consciousness, more clarity, we've got to take care of the foundation first. Otherwise, the nervous system quite literally will burn out. It can't handle that. It's too much. Because the gamma is going to accentuate everything that's there. So taking care of those things so that, there's a couple of studies that report some of the really negative effects of meditation. And if you look at them, this completely explains why some people will have negative experiences. They're not ready to, even going back to the Paroli Project, working with criminals, those guys, many of them shouldn't meditate first. They should practice the yoga, hatha yoga, the asanas. They should do Tai Chi or Qigong and start dealing with some of this. Because as soon as they close their eyes and say, okay, I'm going to do my mantra, their conscience wakes up. Oh my God, all the people I've wronged and all the bad things I've done. So first you got to quiet that down. You have to deal with that psychologically and physically, and then you can do that. So gamma is gaining a lot of traction as the meditative, pattern, but you have to approach it slowly. And even the Dalai Lama said that, again, there's no shortcuts. You're not going to bypass all the work that these meditators have gone through, self-discipline, mindfulness, and then suddenly go into enlightenment and think everything's taken care of now. It'll come back and bite you.
Yeah, you can see why it's not so much of just a plug and play for entering in the neurofeedback process, that there's this wraparound assessment and guidance, it sounds like, that you very much care for in your clients and your patients.
Absolutely. I think everybody's an individual and everybody's got a different starting line. So we have to honor that. Yep.
Thanks so much for that explanation. Really appreciate it. Because
Sure.
This channel is a little bit more technology based too, I wanted to ask you if you had a magic wand and you could create like a neurotechnology device that like served all your needs, that could see what was going on in the brain. Have you ever thought about where this neurotechnology could be and what that might look like?
Yeah, I think we're moving towards that too, because even what we have now is what I thought, 25 years ago. Oh, if we just had this, and now we have it.
Mm-hmm.
What I could see now is, moving more towards electromagnetic feedback because, we give off a big field of magnetic energy because the electrical. And, I envision someday some kind of a helmet or like the old-fashioned hair dryers in the hair salons that we can look at these electromagnetic auras, if you will, and use them as a feedback tool, because I'm pretty sure that they, and in fact they're all over the body, but that is probably a key to really stabilizing the brain even more so than just using feedback on this electrical activity. Magnetic is a whole other ballgame.
Yep, I've talked about magnetic encephalography on the channel before, and I actually got to do a 2-week rotation in a magnetic encephalography lab at Walter Reed, which was really cool.
Awesome.
But it was a giant machine that needed to be cryogenically cooled.
Yeah.
But they are actually getting past that with more and more sensitive sensors from what I've seen. So that's really exciting. Another thing that I've seen on the horizon is tracking blood flow by using things like near-infrared spectroscopy.
Yeah.
Do you think that, what would you think, how would you use blood flow, do you think, to be doing neurofeedback? Any opinions on that?
Well, there's HEG, hemoencephalography, and I've used that before, and I think it's quite useful, quite effective. The problem is you don't go that deep, but you can certainly improve and increase blood flow to different parts of the brain depending on where you want to activate things. I think there's something to that. I will occasionally look at PEMF, pulsed electromagnetic frequency, too. I think that, even though it doesn't appear to be have lasting effects, it is beneficial in terms of getting the EEG to start moving and shifting when you want it to. So I think that holds a lot of promise. And there's different manufacturers trying to, come up with very creative ways to do that. I'm not so sure yet that we have that technology down completely. And then there's the transcranial magnetic stim, which is a huge thing. California and Malibu, there's one on every corner. I'm not so sure about that. That's another, it almost verges on very strong allopathic medicine. But, it's very effective with some types of depression. So, but it's not in my bailiwick. That's something that I choose not to get involved with.
Sure. So what's on the horizon for the Wuttke Institute? What do you guys have coming up? And I know you said you're writing a book. I'd love to hear more about what your guys' plans are for the clinic to round out our interview.
Yeah, we want to start doing more training with people for the meditation model. So we have a retreat center in North Georgia. It'll handle about 20 people comfortably, and it's a real meditation retreat center, we mentioned earlier. And we're probably going to start putting on retreats next year for people. They want to come, and it'll be a combination of sort of philosophical meditation approach plus neurofeedback. And I've done them before. I used to do them in France in the Pyrenees, and they were very successful. I stopped doing them, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, but we want to pick that back up now. And as I mentioned, my wife and I are working on this book, The Way of Neurofeedback. But I realized, I've put my time in. I've been doing this for 35 years. I've treated tens of thousands of people in disorders and gotten projects going and supervised clinics and hospitals. Now I really want to start putting my methods down more. I've written 5 manuals, but we want it to be even more concise. And like my wife says, she's a scientist, says we have to take what's in your brain and put it down on paper, put down the decision trees. So that's what we're aiming at now. I'm always going to be treating people only because I feel sort of like it's my duty and responsibility, because I know how to treat many issues that nobody knows what to do with. So I will always do that. One thing that we did realize with some of our clients is this logistical problem. I have clients from all over the world. So what we started doing last year, we literally send them the whole system. We send them a laptop that's loaded with the software. We send them the EEG amplifier, the EEG cap, and we send it off to them. And all they have to do is put the cap on and put the gel in and turn the computer on. And then I have technicians who do a remote desktop and have appointments with them. And generally we rent the equipment for about 20 sessions. And at first I was like, no, you have to be in the room with them. You can't do that. But I've been astounded at how well it's worked. And even with pretty significant issues like oppositional defiant disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorder, sleep disorder, really working quite well. And I peek in, every 5 or 6 sessions and check on things. But that's been very interesting. We have about 3 systems spread out all over the United States that we keep track of, obviously. And again, literally, the people, their job is just to show up for their appointments and turn on the computer and put the cap on. But that's been working quite well. And I will use those when I feel like Muse, for instance, isn't enough. These people need the full thing, the full training. So
the full quantitative EEG assessment and then the Z-score training. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's been very interesting. I like being able to provide that. It's been good.
Yeah, it makes sense to me because sometimes when people apply to work with me, it seems that they have a lot going on. So it makes sense that they would need more of a comprehensive treatment program rather than just jumping right into the Muse. It's a little bit of a safer route for sure.
Yeah, sure. I've had some people just say, go find a clinician.
Yeah.
You can't do this, But I'm going to shift more now into the teaching, training, and writing mode so that this information becomes more available to more clinicians like you, and it's not hidden away in my brain somewhere.
Well, I'd love to come out to a retreat sometime, and then also when your book is ready, I'll have to read it and get you back on to ask some more questions.
Absolutely. I'll be there. I'll be ready.
Okay. Thanks so much for being on the show, and I'm really looking forward to reading and learning more of your content.
Okay. Awesome, Cody. Thanks for inviting me.